Hi everyone, this is me, Margot, a few months ago back in the States, knee-deep in all the paperwork we had to fill out per IES's demands. One of the opportunities posed to us were IES-developed courses partnered with service learning opportunities. I figured, sure, I'd like to do service. It seems like the right thing to do, a sort of way to give back to those that aren't as lucky as me. But hey, if I'm going to do it, I have some specific standards. I was to find a place whose mission I connected with, who will value me and my skills, where I can do work that is critical, continuous, and ongoing. I don't just want to be another international student cog within a machine. Flash forward a couple of weeks and here I am, just about settled in Cape Town. Despite my well-intentioned, thoughtful goals for service learning, I found the process to be a whole lot different than I anticipated. One of the first reality checks I experienced was the sheer difficulty in managing to secure a spot within an organization I cared about. After opting out of the service options provided by IES, I located a well-established organization that does work around the nexus of female empowerment and anti-gender-based violence, which are fields of passion for me. Yet a smattering of continuous challenges prevented my ever starting working there. Ironically, I had difficulty in accessing the specific space of development due to serious issues the organization's community faced. Those that the organization aimed to empower were trying to change their situation while I was trying to infiltrate it, protected by the security of choosing when I could come and go. Clearly, the sanitized, well-oiled, ideal organization I had imagined was not going to be my reality. After a frustrating and ultimately unsuccessful search to find a place that fit my standards, I landed at an organization that was essentially the antithesis of my expectations. But what did it all mean? How would I function there? How would my engagements look, feel, and impact the space? In order to examine the ethics of my engaging with service learning, the implications of my positionality as a white Western student need to be examined. The way I engage with those being served, the way I can or cannot move through the service space, and the way in which those served regard me are all deeply intertwined with the social location I hold. My social location is one that is shaped around my identities, which are almost exclusively identities of privilege. I've attempted to maintain critical awareness of the privileges that enable me to experience a very specific reality. It is this reality that is so often those with privilege try to deny out of feelings of shame or guilt. Yet these feelings are ultimately unproductive in fully coming to terms with the way in which my lived reality has shaped the way in which I perceive and engage with my surroundings. According to Rosenberger, at the personal level, teachers and students must recognize that as they enact service learning, they are, in one or more ways, usually in a privileged position, perhaps merely through education, but often through social status, race, class, or the myriad of other ways that people possess power and privilege. In the same way that my privileges have granted me the ability to study internationally in Cape Town, they also carve the path that has allowed me to access service learning as a tool of my education. With an abundance of resources and a secure place to call home, I was able to venture to South Africa with the main goal essentially being to experience and learn. My positionality not only impacts how I experience the world, but also how I come to perceive it, which is especially relevant when considering my interactions with those I serve through service learning engagements. Kapor used Vivek's term, the subaltern, to refer to those who are served in development discourses, whose representations are the constructions of the privileged. Western or first world constructions of the subaltern reinforce ideologies that posit the subaltern and the culture and society of the subaltern as uncivilized, underdeveloped, barbaric, and backward, while the Western world represents the shining light of civilization amidst the darkness of the perception of the subaltern. Perceptions of the subaltern are dynamic, complex, deep-rooted constructions that have, for centuries, been called upon by world powers to justify colonialism, exploitation, and a whole range of imperialist agendas. As the rhetoric goes, if the subaltern is the epitome of backwardness, it is the duty of the West to impose its standards of modernity onto the society of the subaltern. Working in development, as I've attempted to do, inevitably draws on these constructions. The Western North and its standard of living is taken for granted as the norm, and superior to the rest, or South. Though development schemes are shrouded in good intentions, they undermine the subaltern's culture through shaping their schemes based on what has been deemed incorrect about said culture. My connections to institutions of higher education cannot be divorced from my analysis of the ethics of doing development work. The mere fact that I did service learning work because the syllabus stipulated service to be part of the course begs the question, what is the end goal of the service learning? Furthermore, who is truly benefiting from my service work? Is it those who are served, or is it ultimately myself, who uses the quota of hours of service to obtain a grade to complete a course before jet-setting back home to the States to graduate with a degree with little ability to follow up with any of the service projects I engage with during my short time in Cape Town? Service spaces allow for Westerners such as myself to engage in information retrieval with the culture of the subaltern. The lived reality of the subaltern becomes educational capital I can use and have used to advance my academic career. Within spaces of development and education, the opinions, ideas, and sheer bodies of Westerners, particularly white Westerners, are granted authority, even when such authority is not deserved. or out of touch. The authority of a source of knowledge is less about what is known, but rather who claims to know it. Who a person is and where they originally hail from determines a great deal about their levels of knowledge and how such knowledge is perceived and imparted. I experienced this personally at one site of service. My possession of a laptop, which I brought to the organization because it didn't possess another way to access the internet or do admin work, an ability to use such technology efficiently was central to my engaging in that particular service. I often struggled with just how much I could teach my supervisor about the technology. Some of it, which felt natural for me to use, would go over her head because of the pace in which I typically use it. Sometimes when I would explain something about my tactic for completing a task based on what technology was available to me, it'd be confusing for her. Yet often I had the final word because I understood the technology better even though she was my supervisor. Even though my intentions were to teach, explain, and support, all seemingly pure and benevolent, there were times where I felt the power shift away from my supervisor and her projects and towards me. I cannot pretend that my privilege didn't impact how I operated within that space or was regarded. I also cannot pretend my engagement with my supervisor, or really with most local Capetonians, particularly those of color or those who I engage with in the service sector, aren't mediated by institutional pressures and different expectations of reality. As Kapoor notes, to deny this notion would only further perpetuate imperialism, ethnocentrism, and appropriation. Clearly, politics of identity play a huge role in shaping service learning spaces, from the starting point of a person or group of people deeming a community needing of development, to the engagements of the developers and those being developed. No category of identity, gender, race, ability, education level, socioeconomic status, etc., can be disregarded when considering how the dynamics of a development space are shaped. While no category can be downright prioritized over another, race remains a crucially important realm that demands deeper examination of its impact on service learning spaces. The tendency to conceal race within development is derived from the belief that development projects are non-racialized spaces, separate from racialized histories, and morally pristine because of the good intentions of the developer. This perspective is deeply problematic and, frankly, incredibly ignorant. People experience white privilege that use their good intentions as a shield against acknowledging their complicity, and in systems of racism actively perpetuate racism because of their very unwillingness to acknowledge it and recognize their stake in doing meaningful anti-racist work. In my experience in Cape Town, as in the case presumably more often than not, white bodies were developing while bodies of color were the ones hypothetically receiving the benefits of said work. Colonial rule was justified through racialized discourses that located an uncivilized black other against a civilized white self. Such racialized discourses are elaborately compounded with colonialism, conquest, and slavery. The legacy of such histories are still obviously apparent in post-independent states, and often are the foundation of why a specific community appears to face the dire needs that Western development projects, ironically, seek to correct. Development itself is based on the assumption that certain people in particular places are less developed than others, based on Western distinguished benchmarks. Development requires the identification of who is developed and who is not. Racial discourses are inseparable from the process of distinguishing. Just as colonizers justified their imperialist pursuits through the language of bestowing civility and progress, contemporary developers conceive populations of color as helpless and backwards. Narratives of charity may actively silence critics whose critiques may productively shape a more just space, as well as hide the power dynamics of privilege at play within the project. Thus, in my development service learning work, I was directly drawing on neo-colonial discourses of racial hierarchies. Some recent emergent discourses on development seek to disrupt unjust narratives and re-empower target communities, such as Robert Chambers' Participatory Rural Development, or PRA, which uses specific supposedly neutral techniques that seek to include full communities in the planning and implementation of development they design. But after some critical examination, even PRA has its holes. Chambers provides essentially no instruction on how to maintain a neutral space free from power dynamics that may already exist among community members. Kapoor asks, what ensures that PRA discussions and interactions are coercion-free? What prevents women and disadvantaged people, whom Chambers takes pains to bring into the PRA meeting space, from feeling intimidated by authority figures also present? This lack of assurance and passive acceptance of the status quo undermine PRA. Within PRA tactics, Chambers perceives power as a negative component that promotes repression and thus needs to be eliminated. The unfortunate irony in that idea is that in framing development spaces in regards to power, colonial discourses that construct binaries, such as self versus other, developed versus not, are maintained. Furthermore, Chambers is foolish in his attempts to shame holders of power or fail to provide mechanisms for regulating power, thus disregarding power's impact, because power is in fact an implicit component of development. Though developmental service learning is a space founded upon problematic discourses, vulnerable to corruption, and often misconducted, I walk away from months' worth of wrestling with the ethics of engaging with service with an overarching, remarkably pronounced belief. There is no way that I could spend a semester in Cape Town without doing service. It's overwhelmingly apparent that I am already acting on multiple layers of my privileges to be in Cape Town as an international student. By being in South Africa, I am calling upon unjust global systems that I benefit from as someone of privileged identities to move around and experience this country, to draw the ethical line, so to speak, at service learning out of fear of confronting my privilege or playing into oppressive systems is incredibly ignorant. As Spivak makes abundantly clear, there is no way for me to separate myself from the systems in which I've been socialized and in which I currently find myself a part of in Cape Town. My already being here demands that at the very least I lean into situations like service learning that may present cognitive dissonance or discomfort in order to educate myself and further explore the complexities of the place I have called home for the past 5 months. What is a trustworthy plan, then, through which to navigate service learning? The salient technique that has been discussed among my academic peers is called corrosively inhabiting norms. To corrosively inhabit norms is first to recognize that as a white student of Western origin studying abroad in Cape Town, I am unavoidably embodying the unfortunate but real norms of moving about in a bubble of privilege. Another norm I am inhabiting is being a white person temporarily donating time and energy to a given service cause. After recognizing the norms with which I actively engage, corrosive inhabiting translates to changing the meaning of how I engage with said norms. While I cannot separate myself from the systems, I can reshape how I behave and interact with other actors within the system. Rosenberg suggests abiding by Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed. According to the pedagogy, essentially within the realm of service learning, teachers and students doing the service must develop critical awareness. For Freire, the end goal is to transform the world invoked by conscientization, the nexus of reflection and action. Rosenberger states, conscientization for those with privilege involves not only seeking to understand the root causes of society's problems, but also the willingness to face the personal contradictions that result from that understanding. Thus, in confronting society's problems and my own personal contradictions, do I find a way to navigate service. In her analysis of how to represent the subaltern, Spivak advocates that no matter what strain we may feel from working within service, we must continue to step into the space and negotiate from within. She also advocates for acknowledging our own complicity in the systems which may horrify us. This is perhaps the most salient of all of Spivak's suggestions. In working from within and acknowledging our own complicity, we own our positionality and operate from it, but do so with a persistent critique of it and the ways in which it has shaped our representations. Part and parcel of critiquing our positionality is what Spivak calls unlearning one's privileges loss, which aims to undermine that which we have taken for granted. From this process of questioning flows new perspectives. Of Spivak's suggestions regarding how to represent, perhaps the one most relevant to service learning is learning to learn from below. Meaningful learning starts with learning to learn by clearing space for the subaltern to educate those doing the service. Crucial in this process is resisting the temptation to project personal values informed by Western ideology into the service space. Unlearning means stopping oneself from wanting to correct, teach, theorize, develop, colonize, appropriate, use, record, inscribe, or enlighten. The impetus to always be the speaker and speak in all situations must be seen for what it is, a desire for mastery and domination. Ideally, what can emerge from such learning is an ethical relationship in which the subaltern can project their needs and desires without influence or fear. Finally, the endnote Spivak advises is to work without guarantees. Spivak believes that ultimately it is impossible to fully know the subaltern, and thus we must accept that we will never understand the subaltern or sculpt a scenario of aid that will meet our grand expectations. Perhaps lessons and guidance can be gleaned from the confusion. Perhaps the confusion, the tension, and the confrontation we as Western students experience in spaces of critical service learning is really what needs to be focused on. Ultimately, our service isn't about us. I have found it deeply important to try to detach my own ego from the service learning space, and remember that on the other side of my outreached hand is someone else trying to navigate their own reality. Just as I am learning from and gaining from service, they are too. What will result from the engagement is uncertain, so all that we can really seek faith in is the confidence that we are honoring the person or people who we are in the service space for in the first place.